Today I will compare a few themes in the work of Mach and Bergson with a goal to explore Mach's work on musical perception and the continuous adaptation of the mind. On the face of it, and based on some weak lines of interpretation that make Mach into a logical positivist, there would not seem to be much consonance between Mach's anti-metaphysics and Bergson's metaphysical intuitions. But this is far from the truth, and they are in fact much more resonant than they are dissonant. They were acquainted by their mutual friend William James, and each had a great deal of respect for the other's work. Bergson even said they came to many of the same conclusions, though from different starting points. He even adopted in a few instances Mach's language of an economy of the mind. Both were, we might say, anti-materialists, but without stepping over into idealism. Here, the biological sciences are to take precedent, and in particular, the holism and purposive order of life as a dynamic process that is always adapting itself to the changing environment. Mach is considered a founding figure of Gestalt psychology, and Bergson no doubt has this in common with him. I will draw primarily from Bergson's Matter and Memory and from Mach's Analysis of Sensation and Popular Scientific Lectures. For Mach, a new science was being developed whereby the processes of life were the trademark of scientific research and structure, and no longer mechanics or materialism. Physics conquered the inanimate, but is easily embarrassed by its inability to understand basic problems of biology and psychology, not to mention consciousness. Just as life is ever adapting itself to the changing movements of the universe, so too science must evolve and renew its efforts to adapt to new domains of research. Science, as a human venture of the mind, must itself evolve. This effort is exactly what Bergson called metaphysics. Metaphysics is the science that dispenses with symbols. Mach did not see the word in this way and sought to follow the same path. Each emphasized that our tendency towards mechanical explanations is a habit that must be broken and which causes false metaphysical problems. Both saw the progress in understanding the psychophysiological relation as dependent on a self-development and as involving events of transformation and adaptation of our minds. Mach described the moment he first considered the possibility of taking sensations as the sole element and stressed how important this moment was for his establishing a new approach. This is precisely what Bergson called intuition. Mach's elements, which are sensations of quality, considered more in terms of contrasts and relations and processes rather than static bits of information like atomic data of sensationalism. These elements are strikingly similar to Bergson's view of images in Matter and Memory. Most remarkable is perhaps the parallel in their discussion of time. Both analyze the succession of tones of a clock, and both conclude that time is inextricable from all sensation and consciousness. Both see irreversibility as an extraordinary aspect of reality, especially with organic functions and organization. Here, both refer to music as an example of the sensation of form, irreducible to totality, and also as an analogy to understanding organisms. Psychological life is the organism of sensations formed into gestalts like melodies. Bergson's metaphysics does make a departure from Machian's science of sensation, but must be understood as arising from that position without, I will argue, lapsing back into a sort of metaphysics which Mach was so averse to. Bergson sought to shrug off the false problems that metaphysics had laid over the mind. He rejects the 18th and 19th century empiricist concepts they used to explain consciousness in terms of atomic sensations and logical syntheses. He dissipates also the idealist crude subject-object description of consciousness. Now, Kant, of course, had already leveled a monumental critique of metaphysics, upending ages of certitude about metaphysical knowledge concerned with God, the soul, the cosmos, or divine law. Bergson rejects the latent intellectualizing and spatializing of reality, translating the richness of sensation into abstract concepts. atoms were just such idolatrous constructs born of metaphysical speculations that Mach set out to shatter. Bergson sought to start afresh with an investigation of the immediate givens of experience, what he calls images. He says to start that the image is less than a thing, but more than a representation. It's less than a thing because clearly it has something to do with our attention. We can modify the image by modulating our attention. But it's more than a representation because it has independence from our consciousness, that it imposes on us, and because its existence is not limited to our consciousness or our spotlight of awareness. What he gives us with his idiosyncratic use of images has the same value as elements for Mach. Both engage in an investigation of what does not require the application of already existing concepts, but instead engages directly with the complex organization of sensations and memories. Images are formed by a change of attention. So, one and the same phenomenon can elicit different sensations, since they are shaped by our response to the sensible. Images and elements are not simply given. We must engage them creatively and economically. We bring them into different forms of clarity and vividness. Lastly, Bergson's images and Mach's elements are both movements rather than things. And since they are movements in physics or physiology and psychology, although each has unique kinds of movements, this levels the ontological hierarchy in ancient metaphysics between a true immaterial reality and a false, sensible illusion. Mind and body are movements, and so there is no mind-body problem. Like Bergson, Mach sidesteps classical metaphysical errors and sets off in the direction of investigating sensations and feelings. In order to form an image of movement, we must attend to it closely. We must adapt our mind to its particularities and not merely project what we think its reality is based on our concepts or opinions. The facts, which are the complex systems of sensational elements, show our mind how it must adapt itself and attune itself to the movement in order to sympathize with it. We learn from fact, and yet facts are not things that are immediately available. We must elicit them, and we must learn to reattune our senses, and this talent and genius for diverse attentions is our greatest resource for evolving our minds. It takes some effort to move between different durations of movement. We can look on the vibrations of light and of those on sound and see how this energy is vibrating at different frequencies, and the energy is dividing itself in kind between those of sound and of light. And in each case, sound or light, we have an infinity of variations in color, brightness, tone, or volume. We experience these motions of light and sound as states of rest when we look at a painting, for instance, or hear a musical tone held at a steady pitch. Regular motion appears as relative rest, grounded in an inertia. We can imagine a degree of tension where, in the glacial movements of evolution, we tune into the scale of millennia. It is like the formation of a canyon, which exceeds human time perception, so that seeing one desert rain makes no apparent change to the landscape, but it nevertheless makes an infinitesimal difference to the process of millennia. We must speed up and slow down our consciousness to tune into the rhythm of each movement, and this implies that each movement has a unique duration. For both Mach and Bergson, the goal of the project of European knowledge production needed not only a revision, but a total overhaul. Its catalogs and mappings had calcified its worldview into a detached, dispassionate observer, describing a reality that is not intrinsically caught up in one's own existence. In order to adapt our minds to movements, to images, to elements, we must set aside our habitual ways of attending and attuning. The metaphysics of 19th century empiricism had at least two major errors. First, causality was closed and linear. Second, realities were built by assembling simple identical elements into clusters or bundles, static building blocks forming solid bodies. Combining these two errors, they explain consciousness as a gathering of atomic sense information and ideas, linked by an empty abstract mechanism of becoming that acts like a film projector, which moves faster than we can perceive. This metaphysics is summed up by the contrast between open and closed systems, and the failure to understand their relation to mereology. Determinism and the conservation of energy, which apply to closed systems, are erroneously applied to the whole of reality. Empiricism becomes a scientism when it applies these notions that are connected to closed systems to the whole universe. A closed system is always part of a greater whole. We are wrong to apply the language and concepts of parts and closed systems to wholes, whether they be physiological, psychological, or cosmic. A whole is not a totality, not a mere collection of entities or relata or data. We must throw off this veil of false concepts. Motion for Mach and against Newton has no absolute if we consider it as a closed system. In fact, a closed system is an abstraction that is completely impossible in nature, at least for the demands of scientific experimentation. Knowledge of a local system cannot be abstracted from the greater context, but the greater context, as a whole, is never the object of our knowledge. Can we move beyond the localized and apply any thought to the larger whole? Mach's approach to this profound question was genius. The multiplicity of perspectives on motion implies a continuity between the differentials or changes of orientation, by which the differences can communicate and contrast without being homogenized. It's not a view from nowhere, but a potential raised but not guaranteed that all places could be reached from this one. I could always, in principle, but never in fact, go to the center of the earth. It is only practically impossible, but we are always in a local frame with its own unique distortions, which shape a regional praxis and practical know-how. What applies on the surface of a large source of gravity is different than in space. The frame of reference always supports and recedes from the movement it makes possible, as the background from which the motion is detectable as rest. Newton's bucket sits there, undisturbed in the center of the room, and astonishingly, its surface is magically concaved. This distortion is explained by finding out that the whole room we are in is spinning and maintaining the water's centripetal force. Likewise, walking on a smooth, slow-moving train, we need to look out the window to know we are actually moving. Movement as an absolute cannot be explained in local systems. The closest thing to Newton's absolute motion is Mach's absolute outside of every local and subsystem. An observer is always ignorant of the movement beyond their frame of reference, which appears to them, by its inertia, to be a relative rest. Movement always exceeds the closure of a system and can be manifest as rest or structure by a change of perspective. The elements of sensation are intensive fields with a sort of gravitational pull and magnetic polarity. An intensive and qualitative content of sensation is not an atom. It is relational and dynamic and must be experienced in real time. Sense experience is a manifold of qualitative becoming. We can, all at once, experience a multitude of instruments in a symphony. Training permits us to attend to each note distinctly and return, at will, back to a more open and diffuse awareness in which we feel the total system altogether. Mach's elements of sensation and Bergson's images both have an independent existence to our consciousness and yet can be consciously investigated, and this process will require from us a new way of attending to sensations which the elements and images have taught us. The physiological perspective of the living body is supported by the homeostatic reference frame of its organization, the informational closure of the vital system of biology, or the behavioral pattern of sensory motor system interfacing with its environment. These organizations are understood by shifting between distinct reference frames, nested and overlapping gestalts. The organism, the family group, the species, the ecosystem, the total system of gravity in the universe. Each gestalt implies a perspectival change across which what is at rest in one frame is in another, moving with inertia. The vibration of a tone passes into our sense as a rest. Change in volume and timbre tell us that the tone is growing or decaying, but the tone, as a musical note, remains the same. Mach taught us a great deal about the qualitative difference between movements at different speeds, which arise from the complex system of relations formed between fields of forces, as well as various changes arising from the density of diverse mediums. There are just such qualitative leaps in the motion and organization of sensation. Mach 1 and Mach 2 require unique analysis, raising unique problems, and in each case, we find new motions and properties that are particular to the orders of magnitude. A difference in degree leaps to a difference in kind. Mach's analysis of sensation leaves the integrity of organization as a fundamental fact, not an accidental state formed by a chance convergence of finite parts. Every tone implies a complex set of overtones. They go largely unnoticed in the flow of the song, but by a modulation of our attention can become a noticeable quality that shapes the music. Mach defends the position now accepted in acoustics that the timbre or sound quality of each instrument is formed by the amplification and dissipation of certain overtones. The tonal quality of every instrument, be it trumpet, a clarinet, a cello, guitar, whatever, each has a unique voice because of the way its overtones mix and clash. The sonic plenum of the symphony is certainly one of the most variously qualitatively diverse datums of sensation. What every sonic plenum opens us to is the possibility to shift our attention, to modulate our perspective to different parts of the mass. The analysis of the harmonic structure of a melody is not exhaustive of its reality. Its rhythm implies a time sensation that is not only irreducible to the sounds, but is the more fundamental sensation which illuminates and makes sensible the other tone sensations in the first place. Furthermore, the qualitative peculiarity of a collection of notes shows that the melodic perception is moving in a different reference frame than the tones. Its speed is a higher order, something like Mach speed. This is an imperfect metaphor, but is illuminating as to the structure of Mach's thought. Each tonality refers to a set of forces produced by fields of inertia or gravity standing outside the reference frame. A melody forms meaningful relations between the notes governed by a different set of reference frame constants. Mach speed, 1100 feet per second, is measured relative to the Earth's gravity and atmospheric density at sea level. Melody, by analogy, can undergo as radical as modifications as the relation of motion is changed by changing the reference frame from Earth to the surface of Jupiter or again to motion in outer space. Each has its own Mach speed. Higher orders of sensation, time, and tone have their own system of constants and imply unique properties. Music in outer space would have no tonal center, i.e., atonal music. Jazz would then be the traveling between planets, and perhaps moving back and forth between several tonal centers. Modulating a scale, i.e., starting on a different note of the scale, is a change of atmosphere. Often the bass functions in this way, but nothing prevents it from happening in the upper register in absence of a bass note. Generally speaking, the lowest note sets the atmosphere. Set a drone first to the key of C, and then proceed through the notes of the diatonic scale and see how many ways the same 7 notes can be newly organized. This is modulating between modes. We can also say that the sensation of melody goes faster than the speed of sound. We are launched by anticipation into the near future and begin vaguely hallucinating the approach of the next tones in the melody. We are ahead of ourselves in anticipating as much as behind in retention. The sensation of rhythm is unimaginable without this elongation of our time sensation in memory and anticipation. The musical experience swells up and ruptures forth from the inertia of time into a super-temporal musical acceleration of experience, which forms a gestalt that is thicker and more viscous than the present, but also more elastic than any representation. Likewise, the tonal order and rhythmic pulse becomes the hidden background movement and the gravitational field in which musical patterns have orientation and force, a train on which our consciousness walks about. Simple example of 3 notes perfectly exemplifies the differences in quality that are irreducible to anything numerical related between the notes. Now, 3 notes will have a numerical relationship to each other defined in harmonics. The notes actually vibrate at different frequencies, and in the case of a major triad, you have 4, 5, and 6. So this note is moving 4 times per period. This one's moving 6 times per period, and this one's moving 5 and 6. We can play these same 3 notes and put them in a different atmosphere. If I start with just the major triad, it has this sound to it. But if I choose another note to reference it from, we will get a very different feeling. And we can modulate these notes in another way by changing their order. I can go up, I can go down. And the symmetry that we see mathematically is not a symmetry that we feel qualitatively, according to Mach. We can play these notes in many configurations as a series or altogether, and each has a unique feeling that can musically function differently. Musical perception is conditioned by a training of the ear to tone perception. We also learn rhythms by participating in them rather than simply being moved by them. There is an energy in the ear, Mach says, that must be released for us to hear anything precisely. Inertia and gravity are the same causes to the reference point of an accelerating spaceship and a stationary person on Earth. A spaceship accelerating at 9.8 is the same as being stationary on the Earth. Although the causes that go into making these references are not the same and have completely different processes with unique potentialities and consequences. You're safer on Earth than in a rocket ship. Both give off their power continuously, enacting motion without in any way draining their surplus. Inertia is a property of the relation between masses. It's not a property of things, but of the interstitial, invisible web of forces that exists between everything. Musical form is the interstitial, higher-order movement that is non-localizable, which takes place on the outside, on the whole, not in the totality of a closed system. Its movement is not the finite, calculable kinematics of a closed system. It is the dynamic flux of relation between fields in a whole. Music is a surplus of evolutionary advantage, according to Mach. Evolution explains how we are supplied the matter needed for music, but not its form. Its form comes from technique, talent, and genius. When we approach a painting in a museum, we carry along our whole past, and using it to contemplate and enrich our experience, we experience this particular painting. Each painting we have seen that day is going to have its own unique influence on my attitude as I approach this next one. Likewise, in music, the unfolding of events in the recent past directly informs the quality and feel of what happens next. The way we are to interpret a passage 2 minutes into the song has already been prepared and primed by what has just been heard. A softer, more relaxed section will take on an exaggeration of these expressive aspects if it comes following a more energetic one. The elements of melody is this new field of shifting polarities and intensive integrations, what Bergson called qualitative multiplicity. And he derives this description and the analysis of musical perception from an investigation of musical perception. Mach, too, was learning to adapt his mind to the undulating feeling of musical perception. Why do tones sound good, he asks. He starts with Darwin. What is music's survival value? We should first realize that musical causal explanations are in fact circuitous and feedback into themselves. Does the pleasure of sex explain survival, or does survival explain the pleasure? Mach answers this by pointing out that a caress is pleasurable before it is selected for. Evolutionary advantage of any novel adaptation is always cashed out in survival. The enduring existence of any adaptation is due to its value in producing the actual concrete results. Just as inertia is equivalent to the total system of gravitational relations, so these adaptations and their particularities of each event in nature, with its unique causal implications, co-evolve on different levels of encompassing gestalts. Now, even if the survival value can explain why musical tones are inherently pleasurable, the pleasure is sort of natural to the regularity of movement in both frequencies and rhythms, measurable as a minimum of dissipation involved in consonance. But musical experience and the talent of genius, which was a prevalent fact of the 20th century, shows us, Mach thinks, that musical experience reveals a surplus of evolutionary energy and value, one that can perhaps even represent the will, as with Schopenhauer, who he cites affectionately. This surplus is able to grow and develop in unexpected directions, forming new values. A rose may come to remind you, he says, of a fond memory, but this pleasure is added to the purely sensual one, and the two play in concert, harmonize, and enhance each other. These supplementary pleasures, with their surplus value, have their own unique energetic potentials that can be released in a new element of sensation. The pleasure related to musical forms like rhythm, harmony, melody, counterpoint, etc., cannot be reduced to either the survival value or the pure tones as sensations. They involve different elements of sensation which imply value possibilities of their own. The will for Mach, which, by the way, is a notion that is evoked more often than one might expect from someone claiming to be anti-metaphysician. But anyway, the will for Mach seems to name the effort and economy of creative adaptation, and this never occurs simply on the level of the closed system from our current reference frame. This perpetual adaptation is certainly a fact of psychological life as well as in physiology. Music represents the will, not that will of German idealism which is alien to movement and sensation, but the will as a fluid and evolving stream of sensory motor processes that organize themselves in time and constantly adapt to the new. We can find something to learn from every moment of our life. Each moment is inexhaustibly detailed. We can know and learn from our surroundings and past without needing to commit each detail to memory or focus attention on each in isolation. We can take account of the immense manifold manyness of our sensory experience and an open awareness that exists on the periphery of my consciousness. Mach's theories about time, space, and motion in physics, especially the reference frame and the recognition of that which is outside of every closed system or logical framing, this beyond has the same value as consciousness and will has to sensation. The tonic, the tonal center, is the musical center of gravity. In music, we travel from planet to planet by modulating the tonic. On the surface of Jupiter, our instruments would behave quite differently and would likely not work at all. And on the sun, even if something protected us from the heat, we would be crushed by our own gravity. Likewise, in water, the instruments undergo their own particular distortions. The way the sound behaves in each of these different local conditions The same variety applies to tone sensations. From the position of the dominant chord in Western tonality, we feel a pull or a yearning for the tonic, a nostalgia for return. This characterizes the form of a nursery rhyme, rather, but hardly the more adventurous and dissonant music of Mach's day. There are always features of closed systems that cannot be explained solely by the objects existing in the local frame. The water in the bucket is either flat or curved because of the presence of the gravitational field making it flat, or a uniform motion, an inertia that is unperceived, which renders it at rest in a curved state. The mind builds inertia in the form of habits, and the value of all our habits depends on a further refinement and continued adaptation of evolution of the mind, granting a new reference frame and opening new sensations. This evolution is an oscillating pattern between sensations and new forms of attention that is never truly satisfied and always calls for a renewed effort. These profound views about the background, the whole, the outside, the possibility of changing our perspective, of modulating our attention, all these evident facts of experience are approached without interposition of concept or symbol. These cosmological insights had, for Bergson, metaphysical implications. They give us immediate access to the ineffable depth of our sensations and memories. While memories shape our sensations, the past and the existence on which our memories depend exists in the same manner as this beyond of every closed system, just as every force exists relative to an inertia that is determined by the total system of gravity. Likewise, every effort of adaptation is tied to every single past event, the whole, or what Bergson calls integral past. The entire past, understood in relation to the second law of thermodynamics, shows us that every differential moment of becoming has been unique from every other. Furthermore, the past never stops existing. It is irrevocable and cannot be otherwise. That is to say, it is a necessary being. The totality of the past is not a closed system, but a whole, open to the perpetual advance into novelty. The accumulation of the past and our perpetual attempt to adapt form a system which grows and develops. The being of the past and our connection to it in memory are what establish, for Bergson, a metaphysical insight that has a spiritual depth. Mach is allergic to these terms, but meets Bergson halfway, close enough for us to move back and forth between their perspective. And even if in the final analysis, we find more dissonances than corroborations of facts, what is unarguably shared by these two geniuses is their optimism for the human capacity to reinvent its own intellect, to evolve consciousness, to overhaul our current systems and epistemologies. The paradigms of the future will be truly sublime in their scope, and our current views will look like children playing with building blocks.